Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and today's video happens to fall on the spookiest day of the year, so I wanted to make something extra special, and when someone recommended I make a headless horse on a man, needless to say, I was pretty excited. Oh no, wait, oh no, I misread that. Uh-oh. So the first step in creating a headless horse on a man is making said man, which I'll do by building a little rust-proof set of bones out of aluminium armature wire, taping it all together, then mounting it on a sculpting block so I can get a good man-horse pose before bulking it out with some aluminium foil. Then once it's been appropriately thickened, I can start the skinning process, which involves just smooshing some pasty pale pink clay onto the shiny metal body. The pale pink of the man will contrast nicely with the rich warm brown fur of the future headless horse, so I think I'm going to avoid giving him any clothing apart from what's necessary to keep this video from getting demonetized. I'm sure it'll likely end up getting demonized, but I'm okay going to hell as long as I get paid on the way. Now once I've built up the initial fleshy layers and added some ample rotundity to my man's midsection, I can start working my way around the body, building up the musculature and refining the shape by adding little blobs of clay here and there and carving away until I've got something vaguely resembling the human form. Now, if you're wondering how I figure out a pose like this, what I like to do is every few minutes or so I'll stand up from my desk and strike the same pose, mostly nude, while staring into a full-length mirror, which allows me to both make sure everything looks correct, as well as take ample time to question what decisions have I made in my life that have led me to this point. Then, after a bit of deep-seated self-reflection, I'll move down to the feet where I can start carving out each individual toe, shaping them into appropriately foot-shaped shapes before moving up to the tips of the arms, where I'll remove the temporary flesh mittens and excess internal wire so I can sculpt my man's hands separately. Now this man's hands begin as a blob of clay smooshed into a flat, oddly shaped egg that I'll snip the tip into 4 roughly finger-sized sausages that I can pinch and pull and poke into slightly more finger-shaped shapes before adding a 5th finger that's actually the thumb. A bit more refinement and I can smooth this fleshy grabber onto the end of the arm and blend it in before doing the same thing for the other hand, but mirrored like hands tend to be. A little careful twisting and pinching with some tweezers will give the fingers a bit of shape and I can give my man a belly button and some nips, then it's on to a copious watering with isopropyl alcohol to help smooth the skin and remove any of the fingerprints or harsh tooling marks. Then with the body built, I can get to work making the head of the headless horse's man mount by building up the initial mannequin-esque detail that will allow me to properly position the eyes and nose. With said nose in place, I'll fit a couple half spheres of pre-baked white clay into the eye sockets and start building up the eyelids and under bags, then I can poke a sculpting tool into the mouthless spot under the nose to create a big open mouth. I can then slip a set of these little teeth that I made off camera by carving up some white clay and a ball stylus, which get pressed into the tooth appropriate spots, and I'll pull the gums down so they're not quite so horrifying before fitting a bridle bit into my man mount's mouth. This, of course, is how our headless horse steers his man, but I'll make those leather straps later. For now, I'll refine the shape of the head and add some ears onto the side that I'll eventually completely cover in hair. Then, before a final body bake, I'll ensure this video remains monetizable by covering his exposed Ken doll anatomy in a pair of classic tidy whities. Why tidy whities, you ask? Because tidy whities are objectively hilarious. Otherwise, with that done, my man is ready to be mounted by a headless horse, which I've pre-built a scale-appropriate armature that fits neatly onto my man's back. Of course, for the sake of easier sculpting and painting, I'll remove said armature and set the man aside while I get to work making this headless horse. Much like the man, the horse is going to be naked, which means making its body out of a warm brown horsehair colored clay that I'll slap onto the exposed armature, building up the body and lower legs first so I have something to hold. Because the horse won't be attached to the ground, there's no way for me to mount it on a sculpting block, so I need to think about building it up in layers, leaving me with something to hold while I work on the other parts of the body. A little poking and prodding with a ball stylus and some silicone shapers will give the legs a bit of muscular definition, and I can clean up the shape of the hooves before baking the body, which will give me something solid to hold while I smoosh a headless neck onto the torso before building out the front legs, or horse arms as they're known in the veterinary world. After a copious amount of smoothing and blending and reshaping, I'm left with a vaguely horse-shaped lump of brown clay, but before I can bake it, I'm gonna carve a dip into the exposed neck so that I can fill it with some red clay before triggering a portion of the audience's trypophobia. I'll then smoosh a little white horse vertebrae into the center of the red slop, and I can get on to adding his tail and mane. I'll drill a little hole into the horse's butt crack so I can fit a wonky length of armature wire inside that I'll cover in an initial layer of black clay. This will be the base of the tail, and I can make it look a little more horse hairy by adding plenty of little wormy dealies of varying sizes, building it up gradually. I'll then do the same thing for the flowing mane leading from my horse's headless stump, and that's this headless horse pretty much ready to ride its glorious man steed into your nightmares. It is, however, Halloween, so I still need to make that ever-important headless horse's pumpkin. I'll make said pumpkin by taking a little aluminium ball and bashing it together with some yellowish clay to create the center of the pumpkin that can then get covered in a series of oblong orange sausages. Once I've covered half the yellow sphere in a pumpkin-colored clay, I'll start blending these sausages into the ridged shell of my evil orange gourd before baking it so I have something solid to hold while I work on adding the front trifecta of oblong sausages into which I can carve the spooky pumpkin face, exposing the yellow clay beneath. Originally, I wanted to add a little light inside the pumpkin, but at this point, I don't know how I'd hide the wiring without having to cut away at both the horse and the man, so instead I'm going to hope that the yellow clay beneath works well enough. Otherwise, with the addition of a stem, that's my pumpkin done and ready to be affixed to my headless horse, who, of course, has no hands, so rather than hold the pumpkin, I figured it would have just mashed its hoof through the back of the pumpkin, so I'll remove that hoof and fit the pumpkin onto the metal bone beneath. Now, before I can call this done though, I feel like my man needs a mane of his own, so I'll take the headless horse off the man and start slapping on some thick black hairy clay, building up his long flowing mane in the same manner as the horse's mane. Now, after all was said and done, I decided I didn't actually like the hair, but I can't be bothered removing it and fixing my mistake, so I'm just gonna push forward and paint this accidental George of the Jungle with a thick dark pink wash to add a bit of shading to the musculature before using a lighter pink on a sponge to bring back the pasty pale complexion to the uppermost part of the body. Some super thin blue streaks strategically added along the arms and legs will add some barely noticeable veins, and I'll give him some eyebrows and some stubble around his chin before painting his teeth white and dotting his eyes with some big blue irises followed by little black pupils complete with little white reflections. A bit of high gloss varnish will give those eyes a bit of life. Then it's on to the headless horse, who gets a series of progressively lighter browns aggressively dry brushed over the body to create a stacked layer of progressively shinier, progressively lighter fur over its flat brown body. I'll repaint the mane pitch black with some lighter charcoal highlights, then I'll do the same thing for each of the 3 exposed hooves before finishing off the headless portion of the horse with a mix of high gloss varnish and rusty red paint. Finally, the pumpkin gets an orange glaze to add a bit of depth to the otherwise flat orange clay, and I'll add some lighter yellow to the center of the exposed cutouts as well as along the edges to try to give the impression that the pumpkin's lit from within. Then I can assemble my trio of nightmare fuel, and it's time to make that aforementioned leather strap for the bridle bit, which I'm gonna make using some thin elastic band that I've cut into a single long strip. A tiny dot of super glue will let me wrap the ends around the hooks of the bridle bit, and a bit of brown ink will stain the beige elastic brown so it looks like well-worn leather. Then all I need to do is wrap it around the headless horse's lowered hoof and pop the bit into the man's mouth, and well, all that's left to do then is make a spooky base. To make a spooky base that's appropriately spooky for a headless horse on a man, I'll take an off-cut block of black XPS foam and fit my figures a little off-center so I can take this cardboard tube and pop it in place at an angle. This is going to be my spooky dead tree, so once I've got the position figured out, I'll remove the headless horse on a man and cut the tree to size before gluing it down. Then I'll start building up the base of the tree by adding lots of aluminium roots looping out from the tree, trying to stay somewhat away from where I've poked the holes for the headless horse on a man's mounting rods, before bulking out the rest of the tree with plenty of aluminium foil. Normally to create a tree, I'd use something like air dry clay or some sort of sculpt mold, but at this point I don't have time for the clay to dry, so instead I'm going to try to use a copious amount of hot glue to completely cover the exposed aluminium foil. Then, once it's completely covered, I'll use the hot tip of the glue gun to carve some ridges and textures into the surface of the glue, hopefully creating a somewhat bark-like texture. For the ground, I'll roll some smooshed foil into the foam, imparting a messy, muddy look before blasting the whole base with a flat brown primer. This will give my glue a nice brown base coat as well as a bit of bite for subsequent layers of paint, so when it dries I'll paint the whole base again with a thick brown wash to create some shading before aggressively dry brushing against the grain to help bring some of the barky texture to the front. Admittedly, my tree looks a little fleshy as a result of the hot glue, but given that this is a spooky Halloween sculpture featuring a headless horse riding a tighty-whitey wearing Tarzan, I think it's probably fine. Otherwise, once I've painted the sides of the base black, I'll add a thick layer of PVA glue to the ground so that I can lay down a thick layer of dead static grass, which I'll follow with an equally thick layer of dry dead leaves. A quick spritz of isopropyl alcohol followed by a blast of watered down PVA glue will hold this all in place, and I can fit my terrifying twosome into their slot, and well, that's us done here and on to the glamour shots. As always, a massive thank you to those fine folk over on Patreon who continue to support this channel in spite of whatever the hell that thing is. And a big old thank you to the newest of them, Lemur, KXGN, Steph, Vienna Wild, The Lich Incident, Abby Lease, Mia Garrett, Fox, Taylor Lunt, Joe Harrington, Michaela, Icaro, I Love You Most, IDST and That's Final, I Win, Brandon, Darcy Two Pigs, Steve Poe, Ryland Rouse, Alexander Greyhawk, Jade Salon, Michael Nelson, and Maisie Moo. You are the big, beefy, tighty-whitey wearing man that this headless horse of a channel sits triumphantly upon. Happy Halloween, folks, and we'll see you next time. Cheers.